We are back with more tips on buying a home in Texas. You know, it's a whole other ball of wax, and you need to know what you're doing, or it can cost you. We covered part one, and we are here for part two. So come with us. Whew, buying a home can be extremely exciting, but it can cost you if you don't know what you're doing. And it's always best to have an educated and experienced agent as your first line of defense. Can't say that enough, but it's also good to have a real estate attorney. Yes, I said real estate, one that focuses in real estate in your hip pocket as well. And then when it comes to really understanding the contract, you need to lean into your attorney because real estate agents like Carrie and myself are not allowed to provide legal advice. And this is not legal advice, let me tell you. We are wanting to highlight some of the things that are going to be differences, like we did in the last video. So, and recording, whether you're listening to this on a podcast or on our YouTube channel, they are both available at the Uncommon Truth Live. We invite you to experience both formats, but it's always good to work with somebody who's knowledgeable and experienced. And hopefully, you're going to take from these two productions of what's different in Texas and learn that you really do need to pay attention to what you're signing and understand and get some help when you need it. So again, not legal advice, just highlighting some of the things that are going to be differences in Texas than they are in other states. So Carrie and I are back with some more tips for you. So Carrie, what would be your first tip that you would say, hey, people really need to understand because there's some serious ramifications if they don't?
Yeah, so let's talk about muds and PIDs. So,
Oh, public improvement districts and municipal utility
yes,
districts. Okay, let's
yes,
jump in. That's a good topic, and it's been a lot in the news over the last couple of years, and there's been some big changes with it. And if you haven't seen those, you can always Google, especially in the Dallas Fort Worth area, where there was a whole lot of public improvement districts put in by builders, and they said
right.
the individuals who bought the homes said that they weren't advised about them or didn't know anything about them. So it was kind of an interesting thing. But we've had a lot of changes in our world about them, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so these are so important for people to know about buying a home or selling a home as well, because there are ramifications there. But especially for home buyers, you need to know if the home that you're buying is going to be in a municipal utility district or in a public improvement district, because those are both going to be line items on your tax bills. And those are going to change the property taxes that you are expected to pay every month. So you definitely want to know if that's going to be something that you're responsible for. You know, if you're looking at buying a particular house in a particular amount, there's a disclosure for a municipal utility district that should come along if you're looking at a home that is in a mud district. So look out for that and be aware of that. Um, there's also a public improvement district disclosure. Both are going to be expected to be provided by the seller. So look out for those and have your agent, look out for those and provide them to you if they're there.
Yeah, there's some serious penalties if these are not provided, and you'll have to talk to your attorney for understanding how that will apply to your specific real estate transaction. But there was a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, discussion about some of the public improvement districts. And I'll give you an example of one of the ones that made the news a lot was I believe their public improvement district amount was like $42,000, but the interest of it that was going to be charged as well was like another $40,000. So if these home buyers would have known about it, they may have chosen to pay it off at closing instead of having to pay it over the term of their mortgage or in their actual property tax payments and stuff that comes out of their mortgage payment. But at the same time, knowing about it is imperative. And if you don't know, you don't know. And sellers will typically know. They will see this documentation in their closing paperwork when they purchase the home, because they may not remember. There may be some key off when a individual such as myself, a real estate agent, looks at the tax records and it has a line item that says such and such municipal utility district or public improvement district. So there are a lot of these happening in new construction. So be aware and be on guard. And of course, talk to your attorney, talk to your real estate agent if you need to obtain additional information on this. But we want to make you aware of these things, and I'm not giving you legal advice. I can't say that enough. But hey, another one. One of the things that I love, I'm going to catch you off guard, Carrie. Sorry about that. Is dealing with property inspections in the contract. And this is a big contention point for a lot of people, because the sellers, I've had many times that we've gone to do an inspection and the utilities are turned off. And the inspector says, I can't complete my inspection because either the gas is off or the electric was off or the water was off. And it's imperative for everybody to understand that the seller actually agrees in the contract to leave the utilities on while the contract is in effect. And you can't actually have an inspection done without all those utilities being on, correct?
Yes, because obviously the inspector is going to inspect all of the electrical systems. They're going to inspect various appliances that are operated by electricity and by gas. And obviously, if the electric and gas aren't flowing into the house, then the inspector can't go through and inspect all the plugs, and they can't inspect the various gas appliances and all of that. So yeah, that's a really important point that you make, especially for people to know, when they're in the process of selling a house, that they need to keep those utilities on.
Right.
And
And they do need to keep those utilities on. And in our contract, it basically says that they're going to allow the buyer to access the property for inspections. And I'm telling you what I remember out of the contract, and not giving you legal advice. I want to say that over and over and over. But when you jump in, you need to have reasonable times available for inspection, and the seller needs to allow you those times for inspection. And I don't have a definition. Your attorney would have probably a really good definition for what a reasonable time is. And I think in my mind, a reasonable time is one that's agreeable to both parties. And, sometimes we have problematic sellers that are never available and nothing is ever a good time. And you just really have to understand, hey, you've put a property on the market. It's going to have to be inspected. You're just going to have to bite the bullet and, go work at the Starbucks if you work from home or whatever it is. But the inspections and stuff, that's a huge thing, and utilities as well. Yeah. So if the property didn't have the utilities on, the sellers are really going to have to, turn it on. It's, not necessarily going to be up to the buyers to turn on the utilities for a property that's not theirs, right? They're not going to have that
right,
contractual, obligation with the utility company because they are not in ownership.
right, exactly.
Yeah. So what's one that you love in the contract that it would be something that we need to make sure that people are aware of when they're moving from other states or have never actually done a transaction in Texas?
So I like the section about acceptance of property condition.
Ooh, you're talking about the as is or as if not, kind of
Right,
thing.
right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Run us through that, because that's a good one.
So, and this is something that a lot of times will change during the option period. The contract will get, renegotiated to a certain extent, and change this section and add repairs. But going into the contract, the buyer has the option to either make an offer as is, or they can list repairs right from the beginning. So if they go to the house and it has, upfront noticeable repairs that are going to be necessary, they can list that in the very beginning.
Right. And when you're talking about this, this is what before they go in and negotiate anything. So, we talked about in the last video, everybody gets an option period if they choose to purchase one. And these would be things that are seen before. So this wouldn't have anything to do with what you negotiate. So whatever you said here, it's already been negotiated in the contract. So it's set. And anything in the option period would be additional.
Right, exactly. That's a really good point to add. And then if you do add an as is with repairs, you are going to have those repairs performed at the seller's expense. And again, you can negotiate these things during the termination option. If things come up in the inspection that you would like the seller to repair, then it's up to the buyer and the seller to agree what the seller is going to do and add that into the contract at that point.
Yeah, just as long as everybody understands that this section has already been agreed on and is set in stone. When you sign that contract, this part is set in stone. So during the option period, anything that's listed here is gonna already been agreed upon. So there's no change in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of crazy that people think, what items like this would be in here? Do you know? Can you think of something that would be in here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we see a lot of roofs in here because we have hailstorms here in Central Texas, in Austin and in San Antonio, and it happens quite often. So roofs can get damaged very, very easily. So a lot of times we'll see roof repairs negotiated. Another really big one that we see a lot is going to be HVAC repairs. So repairs to the cooling system, the heating system. In Texas, it gets hot and it gets cold. So our HVAC systems, they work hard, and a lot of times they need to be repaired as part of this process. You can also see termite repairs negotiated here.
Okay.
And then, any number of other things that can come up. Sometimes we'll even see foundation repairs negotiated in this section.
Yeah, and one of my favorite is when it has a septic tank, when the house has a septic tank, they will pre-put in here that the seller's going to, have it pumped out for that inspection that's going to happen. So that, at their own cost. And you'll see a lot of sellers that want that because they don't want to pay for somebody else's shit, basically, is what I always kind of about. But yeah, you'll see a lot of sellers that want that. And, it's noticeable things, health and safety items, stuff that you can see with a naked, uneducated eye. It doesn't jump in and say, oh, and it doesn't have anything to do with the inspections or the inspector. These are things that you can see that, oh my gosh, that hand railing that to go up those 10 steps is basically falling off. We know that that's going to have to be fixed. Absolutely.
Right.
One of my favorite sections deals with the leases. In our last contract, the leases were, they were supposed to be provided within 7 days after the contract was signed, but it's all kind of changed, and we didn't have any kind of this fancy disclosures or anything like we do now. So, Carrie, tell us a little bit about leases and how that affects, and if you've got a property, let's say, that has a tenant in it, and maybe you're buying it as an investment property, or you're paying cash for it, and maybe you're going to move into it after the tenant moves out.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few different kinds of leases that are going to be referred to in this section of the contract, and
Good catch. You're going to take it a whole nother step. I love that.
absolutely. And the first one is the one that you just touched on, residential. And then there's also going to be fixture and natural resource leases as well. But let's talk about residential first. So at the beginning of the contract, the seller is going to disclose any kind of residential leases that are in effect, and is also going to agree once the contract becomes effective that they're not going to make any changes or add any residential leases. And as you can imagine, this is a pretty important thing for a buyer coming in to have that assurance that, the property is not going to get leased out, while they're in the process of buying it. Super important.
Listen to what she's saying. That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
And then the next one we have to talk about is fixture leases. And so for fixtures, we're talking about things that are often leased, like solar panels. We can talk about propane tanks, water softeners, and even security systems can be included. And so the seller's going to disclose which of those items, if they're present in the house, are leased under a fixture lease.
Yeah, and when it comes to those leases, you have to be very careful because it can throw out somebody's approval because that's an additional amount of money that they have to pay. So you have to be very careful with a lot of the solar panels and stuff. For a long time, we've seen a lot of people negotiate for those solar panels to be paid off out of the seller's closing funds because the buyers didn't want those, and that's what we did for a long time. But it may be something that the buyer would assume. So yeah, totally with you on that.
Yeah, really important to look at those. And then, of course, we have natural resource leases. So we're talking about oil and gas leases, mineral leases, water, wind, anything like that. If it exists and applies to that particular house or that particular property, the seller is going to be required to disclose that. So the
Yeah,
buyer knows
and it's
what to expect.
absolutely, it's important to note there with those natural resource leases that it's ones that the seller is a party to. So if it's something that they're not a party to, they're not probably going to be expected to understand or know that the one's even existing. But if they are a party to it, then you do have to kind of think about, hey, being transparent and providing that.
Yeah.
But one of the great things about it is once you're under contract, you can't make any changes or start a new lease with a residential or fixtures that are going to transfer to a buyer um, after the effective date, after you're basically in contract. And if this kind of thing happens, or if you needed more information, again, an attorney would be your best bet for that. Talk to an attorney more than a Google search. That's what I'm saying.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Attorney
Yeah.
is such a good resource, such a good resource to have. If you have any questions about how these contracts or the terms of the contracts affect your specific situation, absolutely get that real estate attorney involved.
Yeah. Well, what's another one that you think is important?
Well, there's also a section in the contract that talks about lender required repairs.
Okay.
So we can have repairs that are negotiated between the buyer and the seller, but then also there are times when the lender is going to come in and say that they want a particular repair made for them to issue a loan on that particular house. If that happens, the contract says that neither party is required to make repairs. Um, but everyone should keep in mind that if the parties decide not to make those repairs, that the the transaction probably is not going to close because the lender will fund it.
Yeah. And I think the one of the questions that we get a lot is how is the lender going to know? And what we all have to remember is that the appraiser is going to be the lender's eyes and ears on the property. And they're usually going to condition saying, hey, this repair needs to be made or that needs to be made. And they will condition that it is um, completed. And then the appraiser is going to have to go back out and, verify that the repairs were made.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
had that even on a VA where it was new construction and there was no hand railing going up the stairs. And so the builder should have known. They should not have had the appraiser out there before that, but we had to pay again for the appraiser to go back out there and verify. So it can be
Wow.
a little self-defeating too.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's also built into the contract that if the lender required repairs exceed 5% of the sales price, the parties do get the option to terminate the contract.
Yeah, they may be able to terminate. So yeah, again, that will jump in with the default paragraph, which you're going to have to talk with your attorney about.
Right. Absolutely.
So, whew, that's a lot already. What's another one that you really, really like that might stump me?
Well, let's circle back for a moment to the repairs negotiated between the buyer and the seller.
Okay.
So let's say our buyer and our seller, do agree that the seller is going to do certain repairs. A lot of people ask the question, like, who does the contract say needs to do those repairs? Can the seller just jump in and do them themselves, or do they need to hire somebody? And the contract speaks to this very specifically, that the repairs need to be done by someone who's licensed to do those repairs or those treatments. So, if it's electrical work, you need to have a licensed electrician come in. If it's, plumbing work, you need to have a licensed plumber come in. Um, if it's not a trade where a license is required, it just needs to be someone that's commercially engaged in doing that.
Okay.
And of course, if the buyer and the seller do agree to allow the seller or someone else to do that, they certainly can, but they need to certainly agree to that, before the repairs are done.
Yeah, that's a super huge cue. So our contract does say that it's got to be someone who's licensed to do the repairs or treatments, or someone commercially engaged. But I have seen where the parties have agreed in. I guess it's basically overruling what's in the contract, where they say, it's okay. The seller can replace those light fixtures or whatever that is. They don't have to hire someone. But that's, again, agreed up front before the repairs or treatments are made.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that I think is fun to deal with is we have so much technology in our homes these days, and in our life, whether it's our smartphone or computers and stuff, but we have those personal assistants with Google, or Amazon has one, or just there's multiple of them. But dealing with smart devices that are in the home, and I think that the smart devices section is really important, because we have a document called a non-realty items addendum. And these are all the things that you expect to convey with the property. And so you're going to be listing these and working with your agent to list the items and any smart devices you're going to want to list. If there's any security cameras or anything that's built in, you see a lot of homes with remote controlled drapes and blinds. And a lot of those things need to be listed on there. Even a Nest thermostat. We like the automation because we'd like to not have to get our happy ass off the couch and jump up and go change the temperature, or we can do it as we're driving, home, and cool off the house if we've turned it off. But uh, the great thing is, now the seller is supposed to provide those written instructions about those access and logins that are due at closing. So, due at closing is a key phrase there, because, you know, we've got to even write down any kind of passwords or anything like that, usernames, passwords, anything to log into those devices if it's needed to control them or change the programming. And then the seller needs to get rid of that programming off their phone or smart device, and the buyer needs to add it and change the password. I think that's the key thing, is changing the
Yes.
password, because we've heard horror stories where sellers have been listening in on the security cameras because the buyers didn't want them, didn't use them, and left them plugged in, but didn't change the passwords. And that's a little eerie feeling, that somebody could be listening in on your private conversations or your private space, and nobody likes that. But when you have to provide that at closing, and let's say, let's add the caveat, Carrie, of a temporary seller leaseback.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah,
That's a
you
really
have.
good one.
Yeah, I'm not an attorney, but in the contract it says that you're supposed to provide this at closing. So if you're supposed to provide this at closing and you have a leaseback, you probably need to unplug that stuff. I don't know. I'm not an attorney, but hey, I would unplug it if I were you, because I wouldn't want to be listened in on, and I wouldn't want to be in violation of the contract by being required to turn this in and not doing it.
Right. Yeah, those are really important points.
Yeah, because there's a lot of technology. I mean, I got all my lights are controlled. Everything is a smart device controlled thing, which is kind of neat.
It is kind of neat.
Yeah. So that's just food for thought there. You may think that, hey, that I don't care about that stuff, I'm going to rip it out. But it does matter if you see a Nest camera, or, there's tons of different brands of Amazon has one that's, I forgot what it's called. But they have a camera system as well. So you might be careful there. What's one provision that you think is important, Carrie?
Okay, so let's talk about prorations.
Ooh, you're getting down to the nitty gritty and the dates and the monies.
Yeah, so this is going to affect everybody's money, on closing day. There are a lot of different things that are going to be prorated, like, for instance, taxes that are going to be due at the end of the year, but the seller was in the home for, let's say the first half of the year. Well, obviously the buyer and the seller are going to need to split up the taxes there. There's some things like insurance, HOA dues, all kinds of other various expenses that the seller may have paid for in advance that are then going to need to be figured out on closing day. Seller is going to be responsible for the actual day of the closing, and then buyer is going to be responsible for the day after closing, and then of course all the days after that. An important thing to think about as far as tax prorations go is that they're going to take into consideration whatever current tax exemptions the seller has on the property, but those same exemptions may not be available after closing. So if your tax situation is different than the person who's selling the house, your taxes are going to be different. So that's a really important thing to, talk to your attorney and your tax accountant about, to kind of figure out what your situation is going to be and how that's going to apply to the money that you're expected to pay.
Yeah, your property taxes could change. It's because we have certain people. You may have a over 65 that you
Mm-hmm.
can apply for that exemption. You may have a disability and that is covered, from the military, and so you may not have any property taxes. And there's a lot of different actual property tax exemptions that you could apply for, but probably the most important one again is your homestead exemption that
Yes.
you'll want to make sure that you get right after closing. And that changed too, because it used to be you had to be in the property on January 1 to apply for it. But yeah, that's a big one. And those prorations, and because you're going to have to be building when you're buying a property, you got to build in that escrow account. So you're going to have to probably put in 2 months of property taxes, 2 months of your new insurance, and you may have some other things in there that are going to apply depending on the property. And you're also going to have outside of that, like your HOA dues if you're in an HOA,
Mm-hmm.
or other things like that. So it's be mindful and make sure that you look at everything and understand that it's all an estimate. And the buyer and the seller are going to agree that if the estimate is wrong, they're going to come back together and work it out if the seller ends up owing more. But title companies are pretty good on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Title companies are usually pretty good at getting everything figured out, but I always recommend that people go in and just look at all the line items on those closing statements. Before you get to closing day, look at everything, make sure it looks right to you, and if you have questions, ask.
Absolutely. One of my paragraphs that I don't know that it's going to be one of my favorite top ones, but it's going to be a gotcha paragraph. And it's the default paragraph in the
Mhm.
contract. And I want to caution everyone, never listen to a real estate agent that talks to you about a default paragraph. They should always refer you to an attorney, because of the fact that a real estate agent isn't qualified to tell you what your remedies are if one party doesn't actually perform in accordance with the contract. There are so many variables that could be going on that a real estate agent isn't going to be able to see. We can fill out a document that says you want to terminate, but we can't interpret this paragraph. We can't interpret the whole contract, but we can't tell you where the other party has failed to match up, and we can't tell you where you failed to match up, and we can't provide those remedies. And I know this is a lot of telling you what a real estate agent can't do, but if they start telling you what the default paragraph means, freaking run as fast as you can, because they can't tell you that. A licensed attorney, preferably with a real estate based practice, is going to be your best bet. If you feel like you've been harmed in this transaction and the other party hasn't performed, you need to talk to an attorney. There are so many intricate variables that come into play here that a real estate agent can be able to work with your attorney and tell them what has transpired, has happened and that has happened, and be able to give you a more detailed accounting than a buyer or a seller. At the same time, there's so many different remedies could be applied for a buyer or a seller that believes the other party has defaulted, that you really do need to talk with an attorney. And anytime anybody says, I want to do this based on the default, I'm like, talk to an attorney. I can do whatever you want to do. I can fill out a form, but I can't advise you on this at all, because that would be practicing law without a license, really, the unauthorized practice of law. And I ain't doing it. I ain't doing it whatsoever. And so you need to be very careful about anybody interpreting this paragraph for you. And, if you're interviewing an agent and you say, hey, what if the other side defaults? And they tell you, oh, well, you could do this or you could do this. Run too. Run. You don't want to be working with them. They either, if they don't know, they can get you into trouble, right? And if an agent thinks, oh, well, I can answer that or I can do this, they can get you into trouble. So be very, very careful that they don't explain the contract to you, but telling you what it says, and reading it to you is one thing, and say, hey, pay attention to this or go talk to an attorney about that, is really going to be something that's going to be important. And I can't stress that enough. And I know I keep saying talk to an attorney, but dang it, if you don't understand your rights that are listed in this contract, that's going to be your best bet. It's a lot of money usually on the line for real estate, right? For most people, it's the most expensive transaction they are ever doing. And for others, they're buying cars that are probably more expensive. I don't know. I just have a dog named Bentley. I don't drive a Bentley. But, be very careful with the default paragraph and trying to hold someone else accountable, and unless you definitely know what your legal rights are by speaking with somebody that's an attorney in the state of Texas. Don't talk to a California attorney unless about Texas law, unless they are, pretty smart about that and they have a Texas license. So, Carrie, I'm going to stump you with one other thing, and then we're going to round out this one, if that's okay with you. I think
Okay.
we've given a ton of tips of things to be aware of. But when it comes to possession, possession is something that can be very tricky for a buyer or a seller. And I think it's important to kind of highlight some of the things that a buyer would really want to look out for when it comes to taking possession of the property. Can you walk us through a couple of things dealing with possession?
Yeah, so possession, this is the fun part, for the buyer. This is when you get to move into your new place that you found and you've been super excited to get into. There are kind of a couple of ways that the contract allows the buyer to take possession. One is going to be upon closing and funding. The other one is going to be according to some kind of a temporary residential lease. Let's talk about closing and funding first.
I like that
So
one.
that means exactly what it sounds like. Once everything is closed, all the paperwork is signed, and the money has gotten from the buyer to the seller, that's closing and funding. It's really important to know, especially if you're a buyer who's trying to facilitate your move and get your movers scheduled and all of that, that wiring that money over can sometimes take overnight. Or if you're looking at a
Ooh,
weekend, it can
good
sometimes take
point.
over the weekend.
Very good point. You need to totally say that again, because that is important.
Yeah, so wiring money can take overnight or over the weekend. When you are scheduling your movers, make sure that you're taking this into account. And if you can even be a little bit flexible with your movers and when you're specifically going to move in, it's a good idea to leave yourself like a day or a couple of days. Ideally, we want all the money to get from one place to another the same day and have everything taken care of. But some banks set their wire cutoff times at 1 in the afternoon. So if things start to get delayed a little bit with getting everything signed and getting everyone together, that wire could not go through until the next day. So be
That's
aware of that when you get close to closing day. It's just a good thing to know, and plan for. The other way that a buyer can take possession is going to be according to a temporary residential lease. So let's say the seller is going to stay in the property for a couple of months, as has been agreed between the buyer and the seller. Then um, it's important for the buyer to know that they may need to have some kind of insurance on that property after closing, even though the seller is still living there. They need to read the lease carefully, understand the lease, understand what their obligations are under the lease, and also, talk to the insurance agent. And again, this is an important point to mention. I know we've mentioned this a lot of times, but if you have questions about how that lease works and how it affects your rights and your obligations, talk to an attorney. Because there's a lot involved there in that temporary lease. If the seller is staying there for any amount of time after the buyer starts owning that property, it's important to know
Yeah,
all the working parts.
absolutely. And that you hit some great points. And it's important to know that if you are purchasing that property as a primary residence, most lenders require you to move in within 60 days. So that temporary residential lease is probably need to be no longer than 59 days, because you're going to have to be in there on day 60, if not beforehand. And in that temporary residential lease, that buyer who's bought the property is now the landlord, and they have a tenant. So the landlord is, hopefully everybody's getting property insurance, even if they're paying cash. But the mortgage company is going to definitely make you purchase insurance for that property as the buyer, and then the tenant who was the seller is probably going to have insurance of their own, and you would want them to, especially to cover anything that could happen to the contents or anything like that. So good one. I like the possession and temporary residential leases. Yeah, we've got two. We've got one for a seller to stay, and then one for a buyer to move in early. I'm not a big
Yeah,
fan of the buyer moving in early kind of
I'm
thing.
not either.
I think that that's just kind of wait, hold on. So, but all of these are important aspects, and hopefully, we've given you a little bit of a highlight of some of the things that you need to pay particular attention to in the Texas real estate contract for a 1 to 4 family transaction. Always check with an attorney. I think we said that enough. We've also said over and over, we're not attorneys and we're not giving you legal advice. We want to highlight some of the things that are really imperative for you to pay attention to. This is not something you just go through a DocuSign and never look at. And you just say, okay, 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 okay. Something that you need to go through and read. And, hopefully your agent is going through it and reading it with you. If not, you probably need a new one. And I know of two right here that could help you if you need to. So just understand, not providing legal advice. We're not attorneys. So, hey, what else? Anything else? Can you think of anything you want to throw in last minute?
We covered a lot. We covered a lot of really cool stuff.
We have really covered a lot. It's been kind of cool to understand. I mean, there's so many different aspects. It's what, 9, 10 pages, and then signatures and everything make it a little bit longer, but it's pretty detailed. And you need to go through this, and you need to know what your rights are. And we ain't telling you what your rights are, just things to look out for.
Yeah,
So Texas is a great state, and they got some funny things out there. So you got to make sure that you understand it all.
yeah, always good to understand those things.
Get your questions answered. Hey, we're trying to provide you with the truth on the Uncommon Truth Live.